Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to walk you through 3 hip mobility exercises to improve the rotation of your hips. It's pretty common to see on the internet today, you'll see a lot of fitness influencers focusing on femoral rotation within the pelvis. There's nothing wrong with this variation of mobility. It only becomes a problem when you have someone who's heavily compressed and you just end up taking that joint to its end range and kind of poking the bear. Now, there's nothing wrong with performing femoral rotation exercises like this. It only becomes a problem when you are heavily compressed in the hips and you don't have much space to actually rotate that femur within the pelvis. Now, personally, I've had a lot of problems just focusing on end range mobility, and it really didn't make me feel any better. So let's put this into context. If you're a grappling athlete, you can clearly see the kinematics of the sport where you have to produce force in larger ranges of motion in vulnerable positions. And if we put this into context with striking sports, you can clearly see with boxing, there's a lot of torque that goes through the hip in order to generate force in a punch and in a kick. And also just with moving and evading movement, you do have to have good hip dexterity to be able to move in the frontal and transverse planes. First exercise we're working on is a landmine hip aeroplane, where we're focusing on the pelvis driving rotation over a fixed femur. To execute this exercise, what we want to do is we want to soften the knee so we've got more of a positive shin angle and we're loading that foot into mid stance. From here, I want to hinge at the hip. As I'm hinging, I want that free leg or that trailing leg at the back to have good hip extension. And I want to be heavily loaded into my midfoot here. And I kind of want to start with an internally rotated hip where I'm sitting into that hip where you're going to feel a nice stretch on that lateral part of the hip. So as we externally rotate that hip, my pelvis is facing away from that stance leg. I'm going to feel a nice stretch in the adductors here, and it's going to feel like a nice contraction on the lateral hip. Okay, next exercise we're working on is a kickstand crossbody chop. This time we're going to focus on creating a lot of length and rotation at the hip and the ribs as well. So we're going to be coupling hip rotation and the ribs rotating over the stance leg. Now, this looks like a traditional kickstand hinge, which it is. The only difference is we have a band here that's going to kind of force us, or not force us, but bring us into more rotation over that stance leg and give us a bit more resistance when we're turning away and working on hip external rotation. So this is a fantastic drill for improving hip internal and external rotation. Now, to execute this exercise effectively, I want to be in a kickstand position where I'm going to offset my stance, be up on the ball of my toe and the back leg. I'm going to soften the knee or just unlock the knee so I'm in mid stance here. I then slowly want to hinge over that lead leg where my shin is maintained in a positive angle. From here, I'm going to let that band pull my ribs across my hip where I've now got a bit more rotation and I'm sitting into that lateral hip now. And then as I come up into hip extension, I'm turning away and I'm extending the hip and I'm turning the hip away to bias hip external rotation, which is going to get a nice contraction on the lateral hip. So as I come down, I'm going to create a lot of length. I'm going to exhale on the way up. I'm going to inhale, sit into that hip, let that band do its job, pulling me over into rotation, sitting into that lateral hip. And then going to exhale, turn away from the stance leg. We want to make sure that that knee is coming across the midline and there's a lot of weight, a lot of pressure, I should say, on the medial and inside part of my foot. Now I want that hand across, that arm across that lead femur, and then I'm going to turn away and push out of that hip to bias hip extension and external rotation. We're now going to be working on exercise number 3, where we're going to be leaving the ground, moving in the frontal plane, accepting, overcoming, and redirecting force. Okay, same thing on this exercise. You're only gonna need a light band. Don't go too thick with this one. All you wanna do is tie it off onto a squat post. You're gonna jump into the band. Now this is basically just like a traditional lateral bound. The only difference is I have now added resistance pulling me in to this hip as I'm jumping. So when I'm moving and I'm executing this exercise, it's very similar to the kickstand crossbody chop. The only difference is this swing leg is going to come behind my stance leg, and we're gonna start moving at a higher velocity where we're leaving the ground, jumping now. So we need to be able to sit into the hip, we need to be able to overcome force and then redirect that force in the frontal plane. So it's gonna look like this. Just to recap, this is a hip mobility sequence that I would use with my clients and athletes as part of their movement prep before their S&C session. Now, the first exercise we did was basically just working on the pelvis rotating over a fixed femur. This is a good exercise to set the tone that's not too aggressive and just to kind of get rid of some of those sticky points around the hips. The second exercise we went through was a kickstand crossbody chop, where we're focusing on the hips and ribs rotating over that lead hip, where we're going to get a nice stretch on that lateral part of the glute. We're still going to bias hip internal and external rotation. And then the last exercise, we're accepting, overcoming and redirecting force in the frontal and transverse plane, where we're exposing that hip to high velocities of hip internal and external rotation, moving in that frontal plane. Now, the way I would run this hip mobility sequence is in a tricep. I would start with the Landmine hip aeroplane with 8 to 10 reps per side. I would move straight into the kickstand crossbody chop and perform the same thing, 8 to 10 reps per side. And then lastly, with the banded lateral bound, I would do the exact same thing of 8 to 10 reps per side. I would repeat that hip mobility sequence for a total of 2 to 3 sets. So guys, if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe below, share it with your friends, put it up on your socials. Any help that you can provide with getting this out there is greatly appreciated.